The pounding on the front door came before dawn, and Alara Whitmore was already awake when her mother burst into her room without knocking. "Get up," Margaret Whitmore said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Get up now and go to the attic. Do not make a sound until I come for you." Alara did not ask why. She had learned long ago that questions only earned her longer hours in the dark. She rose from her bed, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and followed her mother down the narrow servants' passage that led to the attic stairs. The wood was cold beneath her bare feet, and the candle her mother carried threw long shadows against the plaster walls, shadows that seemed to move faster than the flame that made them. Somewhere below, she heard the heavy knock of the front door again, followed by the low murmur of a man's voice she did not recognize. Her mother's grip on her arm tightened with every step, as though she feared Alara might bolt for the stairs and reveal herself before the visitor could be turned away. It was not the first time Alara had been rushed into hiding at an odd hour. There had been other knocks over the years, other unexpected callers, and each time her mother's fear had been the same, sharp and immediate, as though the ground beneath the house might open at any moment and swallow them all. But there was something different in her mother's face this time, something closer to dread than mere caution, and Alara noticed it even in the dim candlelight. "Who is it?" she whispered. Margaret did not answer. She pushed Alara through the attic door and turned the key from the outside, the way she always did. The click of the lock was a sound Alara had heard 1,000 times, and still it struck her like a blow. She sat on the old trunk near the window, the one place in the attic where a thin line of morning light crept through a crack in the shutters, and she listened. The attic itself had become almost a second home to her over the years, filled with the discarded furniture of better times, old portraits turned to face the wall, trunks of clothing no one wore anymore. She knew every creaking board, every drafty corner, every place where dust gathered thick enough to write her name in it. She had spent so many mornings exactly like this one, waiting for a stranger to leave so she could return to her small, quiet life, that the routine no longer frightened her the way it once had. Yet this morning felt different, charged with something she could not name. The Whitmore house was not large, and sound traveled easily through its thin walls. She could hear her brother Nathaniel's boots on the stairs, hurried and uneven, moving faster than his usual unhurried gait. She could hear her mother's voice, pitched low and pleading in a way Alara rarely heard, a voice her mother reserved only for moments of true fear. And beneath it all, she could hear the visitor's voice, calm and unhurried, asking a question that made her blood turn cold. "Where is your daughter, Alara? I was told she resides here." For a long moment, no one answered him. Alara pressed her ear to the crack in the shutter, trying to catch her mother's reply, but the words were too soft to make out. She only heard the visitor speak again, his tone even but firm, the tone of a man who was not accustomed to being refused. "I have waited a long time to ask this question properly. I do not intend to leave without an answer." Alara's heart pounded. No one asked after her. No one outside this house even knew her name, or so she had believed for the past 4 years. Ever since the scandal that stripped her of her place in society and locked her away like something shameful. She had been 16 when it happened, too young to understand how quickly a single lie could ruin a life, and too powerless to stop her family from hiding her rather than defending her. Her mother called it protection. Alara had come to think of it as a kind of slow burial. She remembered little of the scandal itself now, only fragments, a ballroom full of candlelight, a young man's voice raised in accusation, her own name spoken with disgust by people who had smiled at her only moments before. She remembered her mother's face turning to stone, her father's silence, the carriage ride home where no one spoke a single word. Within a week, she had been moved to the country house, away from the city and every person who had ever known her. Within a month, the world she had once belonged to had closed over her absence like water over a dropped stone, and she had not been seen in society since. She crept closer to the shutter and peered through the crack, careful not to let the light catch her face. Below, in the drive in front of the house, stood a black carriage with a crest she did not recognize, and beside it stood a man in a dark gray coat, tall and still, his hat in his hand. He was looking up at the house, not at the door where her mother stood, but higher, toward the attic window itself, as though he already knew exactly where she was hidden. Alara stepped back so quickly she nearly knocked over the trunk. It was not possible. No one could see her through a shuttered window from that distance. And yet the way he had looked up, the way his eyes had found that exact window among all the others, left her shaken in a way she could not explain. She sat back down on the trunk, arms wrapped around her knees, and waited. It felt like hours before she heard the carriage wheels finally roll away down the gravel drive. Only then did the attic door unlock, and her mother stepped inside. her face pale and her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirts. "Who was that?" Alara asked again, this time refusing to let the silence stand. Margaret's mouth tightened. "No one you need concern yourself with. He asked for me by name. A great many people know your name, child. That has always been the trouble." Alara stood, anger rising in her chest for the first time in longer than she could remember. "Then tell me who he was. I have spent 4 years locked in rooms and attics because you say it is for my own good. I think I have earned the truth at least once." Margaret's eyes flicked to the window, as though the visitor might still be listening from the drive below. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to barely a whisper. That was Alaric Voss, the Duke of Blackthorn. The name meant nothing to Alara, and yet the way her mother said it, as though the words themselves carried danger, told her this was no ordinary visitor. She had heard whispers of the Duke of Blackthorn before, second-hand gossip carried in from the market by the housemaid, tales of a reclusive nobleman who kept to his estate and rarely appeared in society. She had never imagined he would appear at her door, asking after a girl the world had long since forgotten. "Why would a duke ask for me?" Alara said. "I have never met him in my life." Margaret's hands twisted the fabric of her skirt. "That is precisely what worries me." Later that evening, Alara sat at the small writing desk in her room, the one privilege her mother allowed her, and stared out at the darkened garden below. Her brother Nathaniel found her there, leaning against the doorframe with the uneasy look he always wore whenever their mother's secrets pressed too close to the surface. "You heard him too," Alara said, not looking up. Nathaniel nodded slowly. "The whole house heard him." He did not raise his voice, and yet somehow he made Mother more frightened than I have ever seen her. "Do you know why?" Nathaniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alara understood there was more to learn, more that her family had kept from her, layered beneath the original secret like sediment beneath a riverbed. She rose from the desk and crossed the room to stand before her brother, searching his face for the truth he seemed unwilling to give. "Nathaniel, tell me." He shook his head. "It is not my secret to tell. But I will say this. Whatever Mother told you about why we hide you, it is not the whole truth. And I do not believe the Duke came here by accident." He left her standing alone in the dim candlelight, her mind spinning with questions that had no answers. She thought again of the man in the drive, the way his eyes had lifted to her exact window, as though he already knew every wall that had ever been built around her. She thought of the calm certainty in his voice when he said he did not intend to leave without an answer. For 4 years, Alara had believed herself invisible, a girl the world had forgotten, tucked away behind curtains and locked doors, until the shame attached to her name faded from memory. But the Duke of Blackthorn had looked up at her window as though he had been looking for her all along, and something in that gaze told her the days of hiding were about to end, whether her mother willed it or not. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the window instead, watching the empty drive where the black carriage had stood, and wondered how a stranger could carry a secret that seemed to matter more to her own family than the truth of her life ever had. She thought of the 4 years she had spent believing herself forgotten, 4 years of quiet rooms and half-lit hallways, 4 years of learning to make herself smaller so that no one would ever have reason to look at her again. And now a duke she had never met had looked directly at her hiding place, as though the walls themselves meant nothing to him. She thought too of her brother's warning, that whatever her mother had told her was not the whole truth. It was not the first time she had suspected there were pieces missing from the story of her own disgrace, but it was the first time anyone in her family had admitted it aloud. She turned the thought over and over as the candle burned low beside her, wondering what else had been kept from her, and why a man with a title like his would trouble himself with a girl the world had chosen to forget. Whatever the Duke of Blackthorn wanted, she was certain now that he would return. And when he did, she intended to be ready with questions of her own, questions her mother could no longer silence with a locked door and a turned key. For the first time in 4 years, Alara Whitmore felt something stir inside her that was not fear. It was the small, stubborn beginning of hope. 3 days passed before the black carriage returned, and this time it did not come at dawn. Alara was in the garden when she heard the wheels on the gravel drive, pulling weeds from the small patch of earth her mother allowed her to tend as one of her few freedoms. She froze at the sound, her hands still buried in the soil, and watched through the hedge as the same dark carriage rolled to a stop before the house. This time, no one rushed her inside. This time, her mother was away in the village, and the household staff had grown careless with their watching, believing the danger had already passed. The Duke of Blackthorn stepped down from the carriage alone, without the hat he had worn before, and for the first time Alara saw his face clearly. He was younger than she had expected, though something in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his eyes made him seem older than his years. His hair was dark, cut simply, and his coat, though clearly costly, was worn without the flourish most men of his rank favored. He carried himself the way men of great fortune often did, with an ease that suggested he had never once doubted his welcome anywhere he chose to go, and yet there was a wariness in the way he studied the house, as though he too were bracing for something. Ilara had imagined over the years what it might feel like to be seen again by someone from the world she had lost. She had imagined pity, or curiosity, or the cold dismissal she had grown used to hearing about secondhand. She had not imagined this, a man studying her family's modest house as though it held answers he had been searching for a very long time. He did not go to the front door. Instead, he walked toward the garden, following a path Ilara had not realized could be seen from the drive, and she understood in that moment that his arrival had not been an accident at all. He had come looking for exactly this, a private moment, unguarded, with no one else present to interrupt. "Miss Whitmore," he said, stopping a respectful distance away, "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I did not think your mother would grant me an introduction, so I decided to make my own." Ilara rose slowly, brushing the soil from her hands, her heart beating fast. "You should not be here. If my mother returns and finds you, she will not return for another hour, at least. I made certain of that before I came." The admission startled her more than anything else he might have said. "You arranged for her to be away. I asked a friend to detain her at the milliner's shop with a lengthy order. It was not entirely honest of me, and I apologize for it. But I did not know how else I might speak with you, given how carefully you have been kept from the world." Ilara studied him, searching for some sign of the danger her mother's fear had implied, but she found only quiet patience in his expression, and something else beneath it that she could not yet name. "Why would a duke go to such trouble for a woman he has never met?" "That is not entirely true," he said. "We have met before, though I would not expect you to remember it." The words struck her like cold water. "When?" "4 years ago. At the ball where your reputation was destroyed by a lie." Ilara's breath caught in her throat. She had not spoken of that night to anyone in years, had barely allowed herself to think of it, and to hear a stranger reference it so plainly left her shaken. "You were there." "I was standing near enough to hear the accusation made against you," he said, his voice quiet now, careful. "And I was close enough to know it was false the moment I heard it." "Tell me what you remember," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I have spent 4 years with only fragments, a ballroom, a raised voice, my own name spoken like an insult. I do not even know who accused me, or of what exactly, only that by morning the whole of society had decided I was guilty of something shameful." The Duke's jaw tightened. "A young gentleman named Grant Ellery stood in the center of the room and claimed you had behaved improperly with him in the garden that evening, claimed you had encouraged attentions you had no right to encourage. It was a complete fabrication. You were nowhere near that garden. I know because I saw you the entire evening, seated near the musicians with your aunt, never once out of my sight." Ilara's mind reeled. She barely remembered the name Grant Ellery, a young man she had spoken to perhaps twice in her life, pleasant enough at the time but a stranger in every sense that mattered. Why would he say such a thing about me? I had done nothing to earn his anger. "I do not believe his anger had anything to do with you at all," the Duke said. "I believe he was paid to say it." "Paid? By whom?" "That," he said quietly, "is what I am still working to prove." She stared at him, unable to find words. For 4 years her family had told her that the world believed the worst of her, that no one had questioned the story spread that night, that her disgrace was total and permanent. And now this stranger, this Duke, was telling her that at least one person in that crowded ballroom had known the truth from the very beginning. "Then why did you say nothing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "If you knew it was a lie, why did you let it stand?" For a long moment, the Duke did not answer. He looked past her, toward the hedge that separated the garden from the drive, as though gathering the courage to speak plainly. "I was young myself, and new to society, and I did not yet understand the weight my word might have carried. By the time I realized I should have spoken, the damage was already done, and you had already been sent away. I have regretted my silence every day since." Ilara felt something twist inside her chest. Anger and grief tangled together so tightly she could not separate one from the other. "You regretted it, while I spent 4 years locked away for a lie you could have stopped." "I know," he said simply, "and I do not expect you to forgive me for it. I only wished you to know the truth, since I suspect your family has never told you the whole of it." "There is more," she said. "My brother said as much, days ago, and would not explain further." The Duke's expression shifted. something guarded settling over his features again. "There are things I am not yet free to tell you, Miss Whitmore, though I promise you will learn them in time. What I can tell you is this. The lie that ruined your reputation was not born from misunderstanding. It was deliberate, crafted by someone who wished to see you removed from society, for reasons that had nothing to do with you at all." Removed by whom, and for what reason? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Elara heard the sound of a carriage on the road beyond the hedge, distant but drawing closer. The Duke turned his head sharply toward the sound, then back to her, his expression suddenly urgent. "Your mother returned sooner than I expected. I must go before she finds me here, but I will return, Miss Whitmore, and when I do, I intend to tell you everything." He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her with an expression she could not quite read, something between apology and longing. "I am sorry for the years you have lost. I do not intend to let any more slip away without at least attempting to make amends." Before she could respond, he was gone, striding quickly back toward his carriage, and moments later the sound of his wheels faded down the drive just as her mother's own carriage came into view from the opposite direction. Elara stood frozen in the garden, her heart pounding, the soil still clinging to her hands, and tried to compose herself before her mother could see the storm written plainly across her face. That evening, she lay awake turning his words over in her mind. Someone had deliberately destroyed her reputation. Someone had wanted her removed from society, hidden away where she could cause no trouble, and her own family had allowed it to happen, without ever telling her the truth. She thought of her mother's fear at the sight of the Duke's carriage, a fear that went beyond simple concern for propriety. She thought of her brother's warning, his refusal to say more. And she thought of the Duke himself, a man who had carried a private guilt for 4 years, and had finally found the courage to face it. She did not know yet whether to trust him. He was, after all, a stranger, a man of considerable power who could ruin her further with a single careless word if he chose. And yet something in the steadiness of his gaze, in the quiet regret that colored his voice when he spoke of his silence, made her want to believe him. For the first time since the night her world collapsed, someone outside her own family was offering her the truth, rather than another reason to stay hidden. She rose from her bed and crossed to the window, looking out at the dark garden below, the same path where he had stood only hours before. Whatever secret her family and the Duke of Blackthorn shared, she was determined now to uncover it, whatever the cost. She had spent 4 years as a shadow in her own life. She did not intend to spend a fifth. She thought of the name he had spoken, Grant Ellery, and tried to recall his face from that distant evening. She remembered a pleasant smile, an easy laugh, nothing that suggested a man capable of destroying a young woman's reputation on someone else's instruction. If the Duke was right, if the accusation truly had been purchased rather than born of any real grievance, then someone in her own world had wanted her gone badly enough to ruin an innocent young man's conscience along with her own future. The thought chilled her more than she expected. It meant the danger she had lived under for 4 years was not the careless cruelty of gossip, but something planned, something patient, something that had not yet finished with her. She wondered, too, why the Duke himself had waited so long to come forward. He claimed regret had kept him silent at first, and perhaps that was true. But regret alone did not explain why he had chosen this particular week, after 4 years of silence, to seek her out at last. Something had changed. Something had made the truth urgent enough to risk her mother's fury and his own reputation by trespassing into a private garden uninvited. She resolved to ask him directly the next time he came, rather than accepting only the pieces he chose to offer her. The following morning, she sought out her brother again, cornering him in the small library before their mother had risen. "Nathaniel, I spoke with the Duke." Nathaniel's face went pale. "You did what?" "He came to the garden while Mother was away. He told me the lie that ruined me was deliberate, that someone wanted me removed from society on purpose." Nathaniel set down the book he had been holding, his hands unsteady. "Elara, you must be careful. There are things about that night, and about our family's part in it, that I am not permitted to speak of." "Permitted by whom?" "Mother." Nathaniel's silence was answer enough, and Elara felt a fresh wave of anger rise within her, sharper now, fed by 4 years of unanswered questions. She was tired of silence. She was tired of being managed, hidden, protected from a truth that belonged to her more than to anyone else in the house. Whatever secret bound her mother, her brother, and the Duke of Blackthorn together, she intended to drag it into the light, no matter how carefully they had all conspired to keep it buried. A week passed before Elara saw the Duke again, and in that week, the household changed in ways she could not fully explain. Her mother had grown watchful in a new and different manner, no longer simply anxious about visitors but actively searching, checking the garden gate each evening, questioning the staff about strangers seen near the property. She had taken to walking the perimeter of the house herself after supper, a lamp in one hand, her shawl drawn tight against the evening chill, peering into hedgerows as though she expected to find a duke crouched among the roses. Ilara watched her mother's fear from her bedroom window each night, and felt something close to pity mixed with her lingering anger. Whatever secret Margaret Whitmore carried, it had clearly cost her more peace than she had ever admitted. Nathaniel had grown quieter still, retreating into his study for hours at a time, emerging only for meals, where he ate little and spoke less. Once, Ilara found him standing before the cold hearth in his study, a letter in his hand that he folded quickly and tucked away the moment she entered, offering no explanation beyond a tight, apologetic smile. She had stopped pressing him directly, sensing that whatever bound his silence was not simple loyalty to their mother, but something closer to fear of his own. The tension in the house had thickened into something Ilara could almost taste, and she found herself waiting, every day, for the sound of carriage wheels on the drive. Even the household staff seemed to sense the shift. The housemaid, usually talkative during her morning duties, had grown careful with her words, answering questions about the outside world with vague, clipped replies. Ilara wondered how much the servants had been told, and how much they simply guessed from the atmosphere that had settled over the house like a storm not yet broken. When the Duke finally returned, he did not come by carriage at all. She found him instead early one morning, standing at the edge of the small orchard behind the house, half hidden among the apple trees, as though he had walked from some distant point, rather than risk the drive where her mother's watchful eyes might catch him. "You should not be here," she said again, though this time the words carried less warning than before. "I know," he said, "but I found I could not stay away, not after leaving you with only half a story." They walked together beneath the trees, careful to stay within sight of the house so that no wagging tongue could claim impropriety, and he told her, slowly and carefully, of his own history. He had lost his younger sister 3 years before Ilara's own scandal, a girl named Isolde who had been driven from society by a cruelty far worse than gossip, a deliberate campaign of ruin, orchestrated by a rival family who resented the Voss name and its influence. Isolde had never recovered from the shame of it, and within 2 years of her disgrace, she had died, quietly and far from home, in circumstances the family had never made public. "I did not understand, at the time, how such things were done," he said, his voice low. "I was young and grieving, and I told myself there was nothing I could have done to save her. But when I heard your name spoken with the same cruelty 4 years ago, I recognized the pattern immediately, the same kind of lie, the same swift, total destruction. And I could not bear to stand by a second time and do nothing." Ilara studied his face as he spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened at the memory, the way his eyes fixed on some distant point among the apple branches rather than meeting hers directly. "What was she like, your sister?" He was quiet for a moment before he answered. "Kind," he said finally. "Kinder than the world deserved. She saw the good in people long after they had given her reason to doubt it, and I think that was what made her so easy to hurt. She could not imagine anyone wishing her real harm, so she never saw it coming until it was far too late to defend herself." "That sounds familiar," Ilara said quietly. "I did not believe anyone truly wished me harm either. I thought it was simply misfortune, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself in time. It took years for me to accept that the damage was permanent, and longer still to wonder whether it had been deliberate at all." "That is precisely why it works," he said. "Cruelty disguised as accident is far harder to fight than cruelty admitted openly. My sister spent her final years believing she alone was somehow responsible for what happened to her, and I have never forgiven myself for allowing her to carry that belief to her grave." Ilara listened, her anger toward him softening into something closer to understanding. "You believe the same people responsible for your sister's ruin are responsible for mine. I believe it is possible," he said. "I have spent the years since Isolde's death quietly investigating the families who benefited from her absence, and yours is not the first name I have found tangled among their old grudges. Your father, before his passing, was a rival to a man named Edmund Caro in matters of trade and influence. I believe Caro wanted your family weakened, and ruining your reputation was the easiest way to accomplish it without ever raising suspicion against himself." The name meant nothing to Ilara directly, though she recalled her father speaking bitterly, years ago, of a business rival whose name she had never bothered to remember. "If this Caro wanted to weaken my family, why target me? Why not my brother, or my father directly?" "Because ruining a daughter is quieter than ruining a son," he said. A son's disgrace invites scrutiny. A daughter's disgrace is simply believed and quickly forgotten by everyone except the daughter herself. The bitterness in his voice told her this was not merely theory to him. It was something he had lived with, turned over in his mind for years, the way she herself had turned over the fragments of her own ruin. For the first time, she understood that his interest in her was not idle curiosity, nor even simple guilt. It was a mission he had set for himself, a way of finally answering the failure he could not forgive in his own past. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a careful, secret rhythm. He could not call at the house openly, not while her mother remained so fearful of his presence, so instead they met in the orchard, in the early hours before the household woke, exchanging what little they each knew. Ilara found herself looking forward to those mornings more than she was willing to admit, not only for the truths they uncovered together, but for the quiet ease that grew between them, an ease she had not felt with another person in years. He told her of his estate in the north, of the tenants he looked after with more care than most men of his rank bothered to show, of the quiet, solitary life he had built for himself since his sister's death, a life with little room for society or its judgments. He spoke of long winters spent walking the hills alone, of a library he had filled with books he rarely had anyone to discuss, of the strange comfort he found in solitude after years of watching society fail the person he loved most. She told him of the small freedoms she had carved out for herself within her confinement, the garden she tended, the books she read by candlelight long after her mother believed her asleep, the private world she had built to survive 4 years of near-total isolation. She told him, too, of the small acts of rebellion that had kept her spirit intact, sneaking into the orchard before dawn, simply to feel the morning air on her face, teaching herself to sketch from old botanical drawings she found in her father's library, writing letters to no one in particular simply to remember what it felt like to have a voice. "You write letters to no one," he said, something like wonder in his tone. "I write them and then burn them," she admitted, feeling suddenly foolish for having confessed it. It felt less lonely than writing nothing at all. "That does not sound foolish to me," he said. "It sounds like a person refusing to disappear, even when the whole world seemed determined to make her vanish." His words settled somewhere deep inside her, and she found herself blinking back an unexpected sting of tears. No one had spoken to her so plainly, so kindly, in longer than she could remember. Her family treated her silence as a duty to be managed. He treated it as a wound worth acknowledging. "You have endured more than most people ever will," he said to her one morning, as they walked slowly along the orchard's edge, "and you have done it without losing yourself entirely. I find that remarkable." "I did not have a choice," she said. "Endurance was the only freedom left to me." "There is always a choice," he said quietly. "You could have let the years harden you into something bitter and small. Instead, you have remained exactly who you were before the world turned against you. That is not survival alone. That is strength." She did not know how to answer him, and for a long moment they simply walked in silence, the morning light filtering gold and soft through the apple branches above them. It was in that silence that she first allowed herself to consider what she had been trying not to consider since the very first morning she saw him standing in the drive below her attic window. She was beginning to care for him, not merely as an ally in uncovering the truth of her ruin, but as a man whose company she had come to treasure for its own sake. Their secret meetings did not go unnoticed forever. One morning, as they stood together beneath the largest of the apple trees, Ilara caught sight of a figure watching them from the edge of the orchard, half concealed behind the low stone wall that marked the boundary of the Whitmore property. She recognized the woman immediately, though it had been years since she had seen her, a fashionable figure from her old life named Lady Clara Sinclair, once a distant acquaintance from the same social circle that had abandoned Ilara so completely after her disgrace. "Someone is watching us," Ilara said, her voice tight with sudden alarm. The Duke turned quickly, his expression darkening as he too caught sight of the woman before she withdrew behind the wall and disappeared toward the road. "Lady Clara Sinclair," he said, his voice grim. "I know her by reputation. She is not a woman who witnesses anything by accident, and she is certainly not one to keep a secret quietly." Ilara felt the familiar cold grip of fear return, the same fear she had lived with for 4 years, the sense that her life could be unmade again in an instant by a single careless word repeated in the wrong drawing room. "If she saw us together, if she speaks of it, then we must move more carefully," he said, though his own voice betrayed a tension that told her he understood the danger as clearly as she did. "And we must move more quickly, before whatever she intends to do with what she saw can take root." "Do you know her well?" Ilara asked, trying to steady her breathing. "Well enough to know she is not to be trusted with a secret of any value," he said. Lady Clara has built her place in society on the misfortunes of others. She collects scandal the way other women collect jewels, and she is rarely generous about sharing what she finds without extracting some advantage first. What sort of advantage would she want from this? I do not know yet, he admitted. But I intend to find out before she has the chance to use it against either of us. They parted quickly that morning, more cautious than before, agreeing to meet only when it was certain no one else could observe them. Alara walked back to the house with her heart still racing, casting glances over her shoulder toward the low stone wall where Lady Clara had stood only moments earlier, as though the woman might still be lingering somewhere just out of sight. That evening, Alara sat alone in her room, turning the day's events over in her mind. She thought of Isolde Voss, a girl she had never met, destroyed by the same kind of cruelty that had claimed her own reputation, and she thought of the Duke's quiet, unwavering determination to see justice done where he had failed once before. She thought, too, of Lady Clara Sinclair's sharp eyes watching them from behind the stone wall, and wondered how much damage a single witness could do to a secret so carefully guarded. For the first time since her disgrace, Alara found herself afraid not only for her own reputation, but for the growing tenderness she felt toward a man who had risked everything to seek her out. If Lady Clara chose to speak, the consequences would fall not only upon Alara herself, but upon the Duke, who had shown her more honesty and kindness in a few short weeks than her own family had offered in 4 long years. She lay awake long into the night, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling around her, and thought of everything that had changed since the morning the black carriage first appeared on the drive. She had spent 4 years believing herself forgotten by the world, only to learn that at least 2 people, a Duke and the woman he had lost, had carried her name and her sister's memory as a private wound they refused to let heal wrong. She thought of Edmund Caro, a name she had barely known before, and wondered how a man she had never met could hold so much power over the shape of her life. She thought of Lady Clara Sinclair's sharp, assessing gaze, and wondered what price the woman might demand for her silence, if silence was even something she could be persuaded to sell. Whatever came next, she understood now that there was no turning back to the safety of silence. The truth, once uncovered, could not be buried again, no matter how badly her mother might wish it could. She rose once more from her bed and stood at the window, watching the dark shape of the orchard beyond the garden wall, and made herself a quiet promise. She would not let fear send her back into hiding, not now, not after finally being seen. The letter arrived 3 days later, delivered not to Alara but to her mother, and Alara only learned of its existence when she heard Margaret's cry of alarm echo through the house. She found her mother in the small parlor, a folded paper trembling in her hands, her face drained of all color. Nathaniel stood beside her, reading over her shoulder, his own expression grim. "What is it?" Alara asked, though some instinct already told her the answer. Margaret looked up at her daughter, and for the first time in years, Alara saw something in her mother's eyes that was not merely fear, but something closer to despair. "It is from Lady Clara Sinclair," she said. "She writes that she saw you in the orchard with the Duke of Blackthorn. She says she intends to make the matter known to all of society within the week, unless we meet certain conditions." Alara's stomach turned to ice. What conditions? Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, as though saying the words aloud might make them more real than she could bear. Nathaniel answered instead, his voice flat and careful, the voice of a man trying not to let his own fear show through. "She wants money we do not have, and an introduction we cannot easily give. If we fail to meet either demand, she will make certain every household of consequence knows exactly where you have been hiding, and with whom you have been meeting in secret." Alara felt the walls of the small parlor pressing closer, the familiar dread of exposure rising in her chest even as a new and sharper anger burned beneath it. After everything, she thought, after 4 years of silence, of shrinking herself into nothing to satisfy her mother's fear, a single letter from a woman she barely remembered could still undo what little peace she had managed to build. Margaret's hand shook as she extended the letter, and Alara took it, reading the elegant, cutting script for herself. Lady Clara wrote plainly, without pretense of kindness, that she had witnessed Alara and the Duke together on more than one occasion, and that such a discovery, properly shared, would ruin whatever fragile reputation remained to the Whitmore name. She proposed a trade. In exchange for her silence, she demanded a sum of money the family did not possess, and an introduction that would secure her own daughter's engagement to a wealthy connection of the Voss family, a connection Lady Clara believed the Duke could arrange with a single word. "She wants us to buy her silence," Alara said, disbelief coloring her voice, "and to trade my reputation for her daughter's advantage." "That is precisely what she wants," Nathaniel said quietly. and I do not know how we are meant to satisfy either demand. Margaret sank into a chair, her composure finally breaking. This is exactly what I feared. This is exactly why I kept you hidden, Alara. The moment you are seen, the moment anyone learns where you are, this family becomes a target for every schemer with an appetite for scandal. Alara felt the old, familiar anger rise in her chest, but this time it was sharper, less willing to be smothered by guilt. You kept me hidden because of a lie someone else told 4 years ago, and now you wish to keep hiding me because someone else has found a new way to exploit that same lie. When does it end, Mother? When do I stop paying for a crime I never committed? Margaret's eyes flashed with something between anger and grief. It ends when the danger has passed. It ends when I am certain you are safe. I have not been safe in 4 years, Alara said. I have only been hidden. Those are not the same thing. Margaret's composure cracked further, and for a moment Alara saw something rare in her mother's face, a flicker of genuine sorrow beneath the fear. You do not understand what it cost me to make that choice, she said, her voice unsteady. You do not know what I gave up, what I sacrificed, believing it would keep you from further ruin. I have carried that burden alone for 4 years, and now you speak as though I did it out of cruelty. I do not believe you acted out of cruelty, Mother, Alara said, softening only slightly. I believe you acted out of fear, but fear is not the same as protection, and it has cost me just as much as it has cost you. Perhaps more. Margaret said nothing, and the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, filled with 4 years of things neither of them had ever said aloud. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. Finally Nathaniel spoke, his voice careful. We must tell the Duke. If Lady Clara intends to use this against him as well, he deserves to know before she acts. I will not have that man in this house, Margaret said sharply. He is the only one who might know how to stop her, Alara said. Whether you welcome him or not, Mother, I intend to warn him myself. She left the parlor before her mother could object further, moving quickly through the house and out into the garden, her mind racing through every possible way the coming days might unfold. She found a scrap of paper and a pencil in the small writing desk in her room and composed a hurried note, asking the Duke to meet her in the orchard the following morning, marking the message urgent in case he required convincing to risk another visit so soon. She entrusted the note to the housemaid, the one member of the staff she believed she could trust, and spent the rest of the day in an agony of waiting, uncertain whether the message would even reach him in time. She paced her room until the candle burned low, imagining every possible outcome. Lady Clara's letter reaching the wrong hands, her mother collapsing under the weight of a scandal she could not survive twice, the Duke himself deciding the risk to his own reputation was too great to continue their fragile alliance. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay awake listening to the house settle around her, the familiar creak of the stairs, the distant call of an owl somewhere beyond the orchard, and tried to steady the frantic rhythm of her own thoughts. Whatever happened in the coming days, she understood that the quiet, careful life she had built for herself within her confinement was already gone, unraveled the moment Lady Clara's sharp eyes had found them beneath the apple trees. There was no returning to the safety of invisibility now, only forward, into whatever came next. He came before dawn the next morning, exactly as she had asked, his expression tense the moment he saw her waiting among the apple trees. Your note said it was urgent, he said. What has happened? She handed him the letter without a word, watching his face darken as he read Lady Clara's demands. When he finished, he folded the paper slowly, his jaw tight with barely restrained anger. She saw us that morning after all, he said. I had hoped she had not recognized me clearly enough to be certain. She recognized enough to threaten my entire family, Alara said. My mother is terrified. She wants to give in to whatever Lady Clara demands, simply to make this go away. And you? What do you want? Alara hesitated, surprised by the directness of the question. I do not want to buy silence with money we do not have, or with promises that would trade one woman's reputation for another's advantage. I am tired of my life being managed by other people's fear. But I do not know what choice we have left. The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the letter in his hands. There is another choice, he said finally. We could stop hiding entirely. We could tell the truth ourselves, before Lady Clara has the chance to twist it into something uglier. Alara stared at him, startled by the suggestion. Tell the truth. About the accusation. About Caro. About all of it, he said. If we wait for Lady Clara to control the story, she will shape it however serves her best. But if we act first, if I speak publicly of what I witnessed that night 4 years ago, and of what I have since learned about Caro's involvement, we take that power away from her entirely. She has nothing to threaten us with if the truth is already known. The idea frightened Ilara more than she wanted to admit. It would mean stepping fully back into the world that had cast her out, facing every person who had once believed the worst of her, without the protection of anonymity she had clung to for 4 years, however painful that protection had been. It would mean my mother's worst fear coming true, Ilara said quietly. Everyone would know exactly where to find me. It would also mean you are finally free of the lie that put you there, he said. I cannot promise it will be easy, but I do not believe hiding has ever truly kept you safe, Miss Whitmore. It has only kept you invisible. Those are not the same thing either. His words echoed the very things she had said to her mother only the day before, and something in hearing them repeated back to her, from a man who had no obligation to say them at all, settled a quiet resolve deep in her chest. If we do this, she said slowly, we do it together. I will not stand by while you carry the risk alone, and I will not let my mother make this decision for me any longer. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something like admiration flickering across his features. Together then, he said, but we must move quickly. Lady Clara has given us only a week, and I intend to have the truth in the hands of every drawing room in the city before her letter can do its damage. They spent the remainder of that morning planning, their voices low and urgent beneath the apple trees, mapping out exactly how the truth might be revealed, and to whom, and in what order, so that Lady Clara's threat would arrive too late to matter. The Duke explained that he intended to first call upon a small circle of trusted friends among the older, more respected families of society, people whose words still carried weight even after years away from public life, and lay the truth before them plainly, along with whatever evidence he had gathered against Edmund Caro over the years. If we can secure their support before Lady Clara acts, he explained, her letter becomes worthless. No one will believe a threat built on scandal once the true account is already known and accepted by voices more respected than her own. And if they refuse to believe you, Ilara asked, if they choose to side with Caro instead, or simply prefer not to involve themselves at all, then we will have lost nothing we did not already stand to lose, he said, but I do not believe they will refuse. I have spent 3 years building quiet trust with these people, waiting for the right moment to use it. I did not know, until now, what that moment would be. Ilara found herself studying his face as he spoke, struck again by the quiet certainty that seemed to steady him even in the midst of such danger. She thought of her own fear, still present but no longer paralyzing, and wondered whether it was his steadiness that had given her the courage to finally push back against her mother, or whether the courage had always been there, waiting for someone willing to stand beside her long enough for her to find it. For the first time since the scandal that had stolen 4 years of her life, Ilara felt something other than fear guiding her forward. She felt the beginnings of control, fragile but real, the sense that she was no longer simply enduring what was done to her, but finally choosing, deliberately and with open eyes, what would happen next. When she returned to the house that afternoon, she found her mother waiting in the hallway, her face still pale with worry. Well, Margaret asked, what did he say? He said we are done hiding, Ilara answered, and I agree with him completely. The Duke moved with a speed Ilara had not expected, and within 2 days, he had arranged a private gathering at his own townhouse, inviting a small but influential circle of families whose good opinion still mattered greatly in society, despite the years he had spent avoiding their company. Ilara had never expected to set foot inside a fashionable drawing room again, and the morning of the gathering, she stood before the mirror in her room, dressed in a gown her mother had kept from years before her disgrace, feeling like a stranger in her own reflection. The gown had been altered slightly to fit her, the fabric a soft shade of blue that had once suited a younger, less guarded version of herself, and she found it strange to see that girl looking back at her now, changed by years of hiding but somehow still recognizable underneath it all. Margaret had objected fiercely to the plan at first, insisting it would only invite further ruin, pacing the length of the parlor for the better part of an hour, while Nathaniel tried, without much success, to calm her. She had spoken of every possible disaster, of doors that would close permanently, of whispers that would follow Ilara for the rest of her days, regardless of how much evidence the Duke presented. But by the time the carriage arrived to collect them, her objections had quieted into a tense, resigned silence. Whatever she believed about the wisdom of the plan, she was not willing to let her daughter face it entirely alone. Nathaniel accompanied them as well, dressed more formally than Ilara had seen him in years, his expression a careful mixture of nerves and determination. He said little during the carriage ride, but once, as the townhouse came into view, he reached over and pressed her hand briefly, a small gesture that carried more reassurance than any words could have offered. The Duke's townhouse was grander than Alara had imagined, though far less ostentatious than she expected of a man with his title. Its rooms furnished with quiet elegance rather than display. He met her at the door himself, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the same tension she felt in her own chest. "They are gathering in the drawing room," he said quietly. "I have told them only that I have important information regarding a matter of grave injustice, and that I require their attention before certain rumors reach them through less honest channels. I did not tell them your name. I wanted that choice to remain yours." Alara took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Then let us go together." The room fell silent when they entered, a dozen faces turning toward them with the particular sharpness of people who had already sensed something significant was about to unfold. Alara recognized several of them from her old life, faces softened now by years, and framed by the fashions of a world that had moved on without her. There was Lord Ashford, whose wife had once been a close friend of her mother's before the scandal severed the friendship entirely. There was a younger couple she remembered from the very ballroom where her ruin had begun, now married and clearly startled to see her standing before them, alive and unbowed by whatever they had assumed had become of her. She saw recognition dawn slowly across some of their features, followed by expressions she could not immediately read: curiosity, surprise, and in one or two faces, something that looked almost like shame. She held herself as straight as she could manage, refusing to let her hands tremble, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her wilt beneath their collective gaze the way she might have 4 years earlier, before the weeks in the orchard had taught her something about her own quiet strength. The Duke stood at the front of the room, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority Alara had come to recognize in their private conversations, though now it filled the space with an unmistakable command. "4 years ago," he began, "a young woman's reputation was destroyed in this very city, by an accusation that was entirely false. I know this because I witnessed the events of that evening myself, and I have spent considerable effort since confirming what I suspected then. The accusation against Miss Alara Whitmore was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act, paid for and orchestrated by a man who wished to see her family weakened for his own gain." A murmur rippled through the room, and Alara felt every eye turn toward her, the weight of their attention almost unbearable after 4 years of near total invisibility. She forced herself to stand straight, to meet their gazes rather than shrink from them, remembering the Duke's words in the orchard weeks before. Endurance was not the same as strength, but perhaps, she thought, standing here now was. "The man responsible," the Duke continued, "is Edmund Carow, a former rival of Miss Whitmore's late father in matters of trade. I have gathered correspondence, testimony, and financial records over the past 3 years that demonstrate his involvement clearly, records I am prepared to share with any among you who wish to examine them for yourselves." An older gentleman near the fireplace, a man Alara vaguely recognized as a respected figure in matters of finance, stepped forward with obvious skepticism. "These are serious accusations, Blackthorn. What proof do you have beyond your own word and old suspicion?" The Duke produced a small leather folder from within his coat, extending it toward the man without hesitation. Letters between Carow and the young gentleman who made the original accusation, arranging payment in exchange for a false claim against Miss Whitmore's character. Bank records showing the transfer of funds shortly before the accusation was made. And a signed statement from the young gentleman himself, given only last week, admitting the truth of the arrangement once confronted with the evidence against him. The room fell into a stunned silence as the folder passed from hand to hand, each guest examining its contents with growing disbelief. Alara watched their faces change, watched 4 years of assumed guilt slowly give way to something closer to horror at what had truly been done to her, and felt a strange, hollow relief settle over her, relief mixed with grief for all the years that could not be returned to her no matter how thoroughly the truth was now revealed. "Why?" one of the younger women in the room finally asked, her voice hesitant. Why would Carow go to such lengths against a family already so much less powerful than his own? "Because power that is not absolute is never secure enough for men like Carow," the Duke answered. Miss Whitmore's father held influence in trade circles that Carow wished entirely for himself. Ruining the family's reputation was a quieter, safer method than open confrontation, one that left no fingerprints for anyone to trace, or so he believed, until now. Alara found her voice at last, steadier than she expected. "I did not understand, until recently, why my family's ruin happened so swiftly, or why my own mother chose to hide me away rather than fight to clear my name. I believe now that she too feared Carow's influence, and did not know how to protect me except through silence. I do not ask for your pity." I ask only that you judge me by the truth, now that it has finally been given the chance to reach you." The room remained quiet for a long moment, and then, slowly, the older gentleman near the fireplace inclined his head toward her, a gesture of respect she had not received from anyone outside her own family in 4 long years. "I have known your father for many years, Miss Whitmore," he said. "He was an honest man, and it does not surprise me in the least that a man like Caro would resort to such methods against him. I am ashamed that society believed the worst of you so readily, and did not think to ask harder questions at the time." Others in the room began to murmur their agreement, and Ilara felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 4 years. A knot of shame and grief she had carried so long she had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight pressing against her ribs. The younger woman who had asked about Caro's motives approached her afterward, offering a hesitant but genuine smile, admitting that she too had once wondered, quietly, whether the accusation against Ilara had ever truly made sense, though she had never found the courage to say so aloud at the time. "I am sorry I did not ask louder questions," the young woman said. "It is easier, I think, to believe the story we are given than to risk the discomfort of doubting it." Ilara found she could not summon anger toward her, not truly. She understood, better than most, how easily silence could masquerade as safety, how comfortable it was to let someone else's suffering pass without challenge, simply because challenging it carried a cost. "Thank you for saying so now," she said instead. "It matters more than you might think." It was not full vindication, not yet, not while Caro himself remained free to deny everything the Duke had presented. But it was a beginning, a crack of light after 4 years of near-total darkness, and she allowed herself, for the first time, to believe it might actually be enough. News of the gathering spread quickly through society in the days that followed, exactly as the Duke had predicted, carried not by whispered scandal, but by the honest testimony of those who had witnessed the evidence themselves. Lady Clara Sinclair's letter arrived at the Whitmore house 2 days later, its tone noticeably altered, no longer demanding but pleading, insisting she had never intended any true harm, and hoping the matter might still be resolved quietly between them. Ilara read the letter once, then set it aside without responding, understanding that whatever power Lady Clara had once held over her family's secret had evaporated the moment the truth became public knowledge. Edmund Caro himself did not go quietly. Within a week, he attempted to discredit the Duke's evidence publicly, insisting the letters had been forged and the young gentleman's confession coerced. He called upon several old associates in an attempt to rally support against what he termed a baseless and vindictive attack on his character, and for a few tense days, it seemed possible his influence might be enough to muddy the truth beyond recognition. But the Duke had prepared for exactly this response, and the young gentleman who had made the original false accusation, having already confessed once, was persuaded to repeat his testimony publicly before a small assembly of respected witnesses, this time with no possibility of retraction. Faced with a living witness willing to name him directly, Caro's denials began to ring hollow even to his staunchest allies. The damage to his own reputation had already spread too far to be undone by mere denial, and one by one, his former business allies began to distance themselves from him, unwilling to be associated with a man so publicly accused of orchestrating a young woman's ruin for personal gain. Within a fortnight, Caro had withdrawn from the city entirely, retreating to a distant estate to wait out the scandal in private, his name spoken now with the same disdain that had once been reserved for Ilara herself. She felt no particular satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet, tired relief that the truth had finally proven strong enough to outweigh 4 years of carefully constructed lies. Ilara returned to the Whitmore house that evening changed in ways she could not fully articulate, even to herself. She was still the same woman who had spent 4 years hidden away in attics and gardens, still carried the same scars of isolation and doubt, but something essential had shifted within her, a quiet certainty that she was no longer willing to let fear dictate the shape of her life. She found her mother waiting in the parlor, her face drawn with exhaustion but her eyes, for the first time in years, free of the constant, watchful dread that had defined her for so long. "It is done then," Margaret said quietly. "The truth is out." "The truth is out," Ilara confirmed. "And I find that I am still standing, Mother, whatever you feared might happen if the world learned where I had been hiding all this time." Margaret's composure finally broke, tears gathering in her eyes as she reached for her daughter's hand, a gesture of tenderness Ilara had not felt from her mother in longer than she could remember. "I am sorry, Ilara. I am sorry for every year I kept you hidden, believing it would keep you safe. I see now that it only kept you alone." Ilara allowed herself, for the first time in 4 years, to embrace her mother without reservation, the old anger softening, not disappearing entirely, but making room at last for something closer to forgiveness. Later that night, after her mother had retired and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Ilara found Nathaniel in the small library, a glass of brandy untouched before him. He looked up as she entered, offering her a tired but genuine smile. "You were remarkable today," he said. "I do not think I have ever been prouder to call you my sister." "You knew more than you told me," she said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "Why did you never say anything?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Afraid of Caro's influence, afraid of Mother's fear, afraid of making things worse for you when I did not know how to make them better. I have regretted my silence for a long time, Ilara. I hope you can forgive it, in time." "I already have," she said, and found, to her own surprise, that it was true. Whatever resentment she had carried toward her brother's silence had softened alongside her anger toward her mother, replaced by a quieter understanding of how fear could bind even the people who loved you most. Whatever remained to be resolved, whatever Caro might still attempt in his desperation to salvage his reputation, Ilara understood that the worst of her isolation had finally come to an end. She was seen now, fully and publicly, not as a scandal to be hidden, but as a woman who had endured injustice and survived it with her dignity intact. A month passed before Ilara felt truly settled into her new place in the world, a world that had once cast her out and now, however cautiously, welcomed her back. Invitations began arriving at the Whitmore house with a steadiness that still felt unfamiliar. Small gatherings at first, tentative gestures from families testing whether the warmth they now offered would be accepted after 4 years of silence. Ilara accepted only a few, choosing carefully, unwilling to rush back into a world that had so easily abandoned her once before. She found, to her quiet surprise, that she no longer needed the approval of every drawing room she entered, that 4 years of solitude had taught her a kind of selectiveness about which opinions truly mattered to her, and which could be politely set aside. The first gathering she attended was a small tea hosted by the same older gentleman who had spoken so kindly of her father during the Duke's revelation, and she found herself received with a warmth that still felt almost foreign after so many years of assumed shame. Conversations that once would have circled carefully around her past now touched it directly, guests asking gently after her well-being, curious not out of malice, but genuine concern for what she had endured. It took her several such gatherings to stop bracing herself for cruelty that never came. But each gathering she attended left her a little steadier, a little more certain that the ground beneath her had finally stopped shifting. She began, slowly, to rebuild the small threads of friendship that had once made up her life before the scandal, though she remained closest of all to the small circle who had proven their loyalty during the darkest of her hidden years, her brother chief among them. The Duke called upon her often during those weeks, no longer forced to hide among apple trees or arrange elaborate distractions to steal a private moment. He came openly now, welcomed at the front door by a mother who had once trembled at the sight of his carriage, and Ilara found herself looking forward to his visits with a warmth she no longer tried to hide from herself. They walked together in the garden one afternoon, the same garden where she had once knelt in the dirt and watched him arrive as a stranger, and she found herself struck by how much had changed in so short a time, and how much, strangely, remained exactly the same. The quiet ease between them had only deepened, and the questions that had once separated them, questions of truth and trust and old grief, had given way to something steadier. "I have been thinking," he said, as they paused beside the same trellis where he had first spoken her name aloud in that garden, "that I owe you an apology I have not yet properly given." Ilara raised an eyebrow, curious. "You have apologized to me a great many times already, for a great many things. None of them for this," he said. "I did not come to you that first day out of pure justice, or even entirely out of guilt over my silence 4 years ago. I came because I had watched you from a distance for longer than I let you believe. Long before Lady Clara ever saw us in the orchard, long before I arranged for your mother to be occupied at the milliner's shop. I have known where you were hidden for nearly 2 years, Ilara. I simply did not have the courage, until recently, to act on what I already knew." Ilara stared at him, startled by the admission. 2 years? Why did you wait so long? 2 years ago, he continued, before she could press further, I attended a memorial for a mutual acquaintance of our father's, and I overheard your name mentioned in passing, spoken with the same casual cruelty I remembered from the night of your ruin, as though your disgrace were simply an accepted fact of the world, unworthy of further thought. I asked a few careful questions afterward, and learned where you had been sent, and something in me could not let the matter rest after that. I told myself I was simply curious, that I owed a debt of conscience to look further into what had happened to you, given my own failure to speak 4 years before. But curiosity does not explain why I found myself, on more than one occasion, riding past this very estate simply for the chance of glimpsing you in the garden from a distance, never once intending to approach. You watched me, Elara said slowly, uncertain whether to feel unsettled or moved by the admission. From a distance, and never without shame at my own hesitation, he said, I told myself each time that I would find the courage to introduce myself properly, and each time I found some reason to delay, some excuse that felt, in hindsight, more like cowardice than caution. Because I did not know how to explain myself without frightening you away entirely, he admitted. I told myself I was gathering evidence against Caro, building a case strong enough to justify my involvement before I ever approached you. And that was true, in part. But it was also, I think, an excuse. I was afraid that if I came to you too soon, without the shield of justice to explain my presence, you would see only a stranger with an unsettling interest in a woman he had never properly met. And now? She asked softly. Now that the shield is no longer necessary. Now, he said, taking a slow breath, I find I have no excuse left to hide behind, and no wish to hide any longer. I have watched you endure 4 years of silence with a strength I have rarely seen matched, even among people who never faced a fraction of what was asked of you. I watched you rebuild yourself in secret, tend a garden no one else valued, write letters to no one simply to remember your own voice. I did not fall in love with the woman you became after the truth was revealed, Elara. I fell in love with the woman who survived long before anyone else knew to look for her. The words settled over her like warmth after a long winter, and for a moment she could not find her voice at all. She thought of the girl she had been on the night of the ball, and the woman who stood in this garden now, changed by every hard year in between, and understood that he had seen her clearly at every stage of that transformation, when even she herself had struggled to recognize who she was becoming. I do not know how to answer that, she said finally, her voice unsteady. No one has ever spoken to me the way you speak to me, not before the scandal, and certainly not after. You do not need to answer with words, he said gently. I only wished you to know the truth of it, since truth is the one thing I have learned never to withhold from you again. She reached for his hand then, an act so small it would have seemed unremarkable in any other courtship, and yet for Elara it carried the weight of everything she had reclaimed over the past month, her voice, her choices, her right to be seen. I think, she said slowly, that I have loved you since the morning you stood in the drive and looked up at my window as though the walls themselves meant nothing to you. I did not understand it then. I understand it now. They stood together in the quiet garden for a long moment, neither speaking, the silence between them full in a way. Silence had never been full for Elara before, not the empty, waiting silence of hiding, but the warm, settled silence of finally being known. Her mother's reconciliation with her came slowly, in small gestures rather than grand declarations. A shared cup of tea in the mornings, a quiet conversation about the years lost, that neither of them tried to rush toward forgiveness too quickly. Margaret never fully explained the depth of her fear of Caro, though Elara suspected there were threats made against the family long before her own scandal. Threats her mother had carried alone, and never spoken of even now. But the distance between them had softened considerably, replaced by something more honest than the careful management that had defined their relationship for 4 long years. Nathaniel, too, found his own quiet redemption in the weeks that followed, taking a more active role in restoring what remained of the family's standing in trade circles, meeting personally with several of his father's former associates, to rebuild connections Caro's scheming had damaged. He proved surprisingly capable at the work, patient and methodical, in a way that reminded Elara of their late father, and within a few months, the Whitmore name carried a measure of respect in trade circles it had not held since before the scandal first darkened the family's fortunes. He and Elara grew closer than they had been since childhood, their shared ordeal forging a bond neither of them had expected to find on the other side of so much hardship. They took to walking together in the mornings, much as she once had with the Duke, though their conversations now ranged freely over subjects that had nothing to do with old secrets or hidden fears, simple things, books they had read, small hopes for the future, the easy companionship of siblings who had finally stopped keeping secrets from one another. Lady Clara Sinclair's fate proved less fortunate. Stripped of the leverage her threat had once held, and increasingly shunned by a society that had learned the full extent of her attempted extortion, she withdrew from the city entirely within a matter of weeks, her own reputation suffering a fraction of the ruin she had once tried to inflict upon Elara. Elara felt no particular triumph in her downfall, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that cruelty, however cleverly disguised, rarely survived contact with the truth for long. On a bright autumn morning, nearly 2 months after the Duke's gathering had first cracked open the truth of her 4 years in hiding, Ilara stood once more in the garden where so much of her transformation had unfolded, dressed not in her mother's old, altered gowns but in a new dress chosen entirely for herself, a soft shade of gold that caught the morning light exactly the way she had always imagined freedom might look, if freedom had a color at all. The Duke arrived not by carriage this time but on foot, walking the same path through the orchard he had once used to avoid her mother's watchful eyes, though now there was no need for secrecy at all. He found her waiting by the same trellis, and something in his expression told her that this visit carried a different weight than all the ones before it. "I have spoken with your mother," he said, his voice steady but touched with something like nervous hope. "And with your brother. I have their blessing, if you will have mine." Ilara felt her breath catch, though she had, in some quiet part of her heart, been waiting for exactly this moment since the afternoon in the garden weeks before. Have their blessing for what, precisely, she asked, though she already knew. He knelt then, right there among the roses her mother had once tended in silence and worry, and asked her the question she had never truly believed, during 4 long years of hiding, that anyone would ever ask her again. She said yes before he had even finished speaking, her voice breaking with a joy so complete it startled her. 4 years of shadow giving way at last, to a morning so bright it seemed impossible she had ever doubted it would come. News of their engagement spread through society quickly, though this time the whispers that followed Ilara's name carried admiration rather than scorn, curiosity about the woman who had endured so much and emerged not diminished but transformed. She did not become a duchess to erase the years she had spent hidden away, she understood, but to honor them, to prove that whatever had been taken from her by a stranger's lie could still, in time, be given back in full, and more besides. On the day of their wedding, held in the same garden where their private meetings had once been carried out in secret and fear, Ilara stood beneath an arch of white roses and looked out at the small crowd gathered to witness her joy, a crowd that included her mother, finally at peace, her brother, standing tall and proud beside her, and the many faces of a society that had once forgotten her, and now, at last, remembered her rightly. The morning had dawned clear and mild, the kind of gentle autumn light that seemed to soften every edge of the world, and the orchard beyond the garden wall stood heavy with the last of its fruit, the same trees beneath which she and the Duke had once whispered secrets too dangerous to speak aloud anywhere else. Ilara found herself glancing toward those trees more than once as she waited for the ceremony to begin, remembering the frightened, uncertain woman she had been the first morning she found him standing among them, and marveling at how far that same woman had traveled since. Her mother approached her quietly before the ceremony began, smoothing a stray curl from Ilara's face with the same gentle care she might have shown a much younger daughter. "I know I cannot undo the years I kept you hidden," Margaret said softly. "But I hope you know that watching you stand here today, so completely yourself, is the greatest relief I have known since your father passed." "I know, Mother," Ilara said, taking her hand. "We do not need to undo the past to move forward from it. I have already forgiven you. I only needed you to see me clearly, and you finally do." The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur, vows spoken plainly and without ornamentation, exactly as Ilara had asked. No elaborate display, only the simple truth of two people choosing each other openly, after so many months of choosing each other in secret first. When the Duke slipped the ring onto her hand, she felt not the closing of one chapter but the wide, deliberate opening of another, a life no longer defined by hiding, by fear, or by the lies of men who had once believed they could erase her from the world simply by deciding she did not deserve a place in it. The Duke of Blackthorn took her hand before the assembled guests, and as their vows were spoken beneath the open sky, Ilara felt the last of the old shadow lift entirely from her heart. She had spent 4 years believing herself invisible, hidden away by the fear of others and the cruelty of a stranger's lie. She stood now in the full light of day, seen at last by everyone who mattered, loved by a man who had never once looked away, and free, finally and completely, to begin the life that had always been waiting for her. 2 years after her wedding, Ilara Voss, Duchess of Blackthorn, stood at the window of her northern estate and watched the first snow of the season settle over the hills her husband had once described to her beneath the apple trees of her mother's orchard. She had grown to love this quiet, solitary country he called home, its wide open skies and long silences so different from the crowded drawing rooms of the city. And yet she never tired of returning to that city each spring, if only to walk once more through the garden where her old life had ended, and her new one had begun. Her mother had come to visit for the winter, along with Nathaniel, who had recently taken a wife of his own, a quiet, clever woman named Beatrice who had won Ilara's affection almost instantly with her dry wit and unshakable kindness. Beatrice had grown up far from the pressures of city society, the daughter of a modest but respected merchant family in the north, and she brought with her a refreshing bluntness that Ilara had come to treasure during their short acquaintance, a willingness to laugh at pretension wherever she found it, including, quite often, her own husband's occasional seriousness. Nathaniel had proposed to her only months after their father's old trade connections had been fully restored, and Ilara suspected, though her brother never fully admitted it, that meeting Beatrice had played no small part in helping him finally release the guilt he had carried since the years of Ilara's hidden confinement. Beatrice had a way of reminding him gently, whenever old shadows crept back into his thoughts, that the past could be honored without being endlessly relived, and Ilara found herself grateful to her new sister for the lightness she had brought into her brother's life. The house was full in a way Ilara had once believed she would never know again, full of voices and laughter, and the small, ordinary chaos of a family finally at peace with itself. Children's laughter would come later, Ilara often thought with quiet hope, though for now she was content simply to watch her family gather whole and unburdened around a single table, something she had once feared she would never witness again. She thought often, in quieter moments, of the years she had spent hidden away, and found that the memory no longer carried the same sharp grief it once had. It had settled instead into something closer to understanding, a part of her history that had shaped her without defining the whole of who she had become. She had learned, during those long years of silence, a patience and quiet resilience she still called upon whenever life presented its inevitable difficulties, and she found herself, more often than not, grateful for the strength that hardship had built in her, even as she never wished such suffering upon anyone else. Edmund Caro's name surfaced only rarely now, mentioned in passing as a cautionary tale among the trade circles he had once dominated, a man who had traded his reputation for a scheme that ultimately cost him everything he had sought to protect. Ilara felt no lingering anger toward him, only a distant, settled satisfaction that the truth had outlasted his lies, exactly as her husband had once promised her it would. Lady Clara Sinclair, too, had faded from the concerns of society entirely, her attempted scheme against the Whitmore family remembered now, when it was remembered at all, as a minor scandal eclipsed by the larger truth it had failed to bury. Ilara did not think of her often, though she sometimes wondered, with more compassion than she might once have expected, whether Lady Clara had ever found the peace that had so long eluded her own ambitions. One afternoon in early winter, as the snow continued to gather outside the tall windows of the northern estate, Ilara found her husband in his study, poring over correspondence from the tenants he looked after with such careful attention. She settled into the chair across from him, watching him work with the quiet contentment that had become so familiar over their 2 years of marriage, a contentment she still sometimes marveled at, remembering the frightened girl who had once believed herself unworthy of being seen at all. "You are staring," he said without looking up, though the small smile at the corner of his mouth told her he did not mind in the least. "I am remembering," she said, "the morning you first stood in my mother's drive, looking up at my window as though the walls meant nothing to you." He set down his pen and met her eyes, the same steady warmth in his gaze that had first drawn her to him beneath the apple trees so long ago. "I remember it well. I have never been more frightened in my life than I was that morning, certain I would be turned away before I ever had the chance to explain myself." "You hit it well," she said. "I had a great deal of practice hiding things by then," he admitted, "though I am glad those days are behind us both." She rose and crossed to stand beside him, resting a hand on his shoulder as she looked out at the snow gathering steadily over the hills beyond the window. "So am I," she said quietly. "I spent so many years believing myself forgotten, invisible to a world that had decided I did not matter enough to be seen clearly. I did not understand, until you found me, how much of that invisibility was never truly about me at all. It was about the fears and failures of people who found it easier to hide me away than to fight for the truth." He reached up and covered her hand with his own. "And now, she said, I am seen exactly as I am, by the people who matter most, and I find that I no longer fear being known. That is a gift I did not expect to receive, after everything that came before it." Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the hills in a quiet white blanket that reminded Ilara, in its own way, of the long years of silence she had once endured, though this silence carried none of the old grief. It was peaceful now, chosen rather than imposed, the quiet of a life fully and freely lived rather than one hidden away out of fear. Later that evening, the family gathered together in the great hall for supper. her mother seated beside Nathaniel and his new wife, the fire crackling warmly against the winter chill outside. Margaret had changed considerably in the 2 years since the truth had come to light. Softer now, quicker to laugh, though still carrying, in quiet, unguarded moments, the shadow of the years she had spent living in fear of Caro's reach. Ilara had come to understand her mother's choices differently with time and distance, not excusing the pain those choices had caused, but recognizing at last the terror that had driven them, a terror Margaret had carried largely alone, for far longer than anyone in the family had ever fully realized. After supper, as the others settled by the fire with cups of warm cider, Ilara stepped out onto the terrace alone for a few quiet moments, wrapping her shawl tightly against the cold and watching her breath fog gently in the winter air. The stars above the northern hills burned brighter than she remembered them ever burning over the city, undimmed by smoke or crowded rooftops, and she found herself thinking, as she often did in such quiet moments, of the young woman who had once sat alone in an attic, listening through a cracked shutter for the voice of a stranger who would, against every expectation, become the truest companion of her life. She did not regret those years entirely, though she would never wish them upon another soul. They had taught her the true weight of silence, and by contrast, the true value of being finally and completely known. She thought of her father, gone now for many years, and wondered whether he would recognize the woman she had become, wondered whether he would be proud of the quiet strength she had built from the wreckage of a lie meant to destroy her entirely. The door behind her opened softly, and her husband stepped out to join her on the terrace, draping his own coat over her shoulders against the cold. "You will catch a chill out here," he said gently. "I wanted a moment to remember," she said. "It helps me appreciate what I have now, when I remember clearly what I once did not." He wrapped an arm around her, and together they stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow settle over the hills that had become her home in every sense that mattered. She thought of the letters she had once written and burned, words meant for no one, simply to remember she still had a voice worth using. She no longer needed to burn her words now. She spoke them freely, to her husband, to her mother, to her brother, and each time she did, she felt another small piece of the old silence dissolve into something warmer. "Do you ever think of the orchard?" she asked him quietly. "Every time I walk beneath apple trees," he said. "I do not think I will ever pass one without remembering the morning I first found the courage to speak to you properly, terrified you would send me away before I finished a single sentence." "I very nearly did," she admitted, smiling at the memory now instead of flinching from it. "I remember thinking you were either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, trespassing into my mother's garden with no assurance I would not simply scream for the staff. I considered that possibility rather seriously beforehand," he admitted, "and decided the risk was worth it regardless. I do not regret it, not for a single moment, whatever the outcome might have been that morning." "Nor do I," she said, resting her head against his shoulder as the snow continued to drift silently down around them. Whatever difficulties life might still bring, whatever shadows might still occasionally cross her path, Ilara understood now, with a certainty she had not possessed during those long hidden years, that she would never again let herself be erased by another person's fear or another person's lie. She had fought her way back into the light once, and she intended to remain there, fully seen and fully herself, for the rest of the life still waiting to unfold before her. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, her family's laughter drifting faintly through the closed doors, and Ilara turned at last from the winter stars to rejoin them, no longer a shadow kept hidden from the world, but a woman finally, completely, and permanently home.